Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our first Gator Great Book Club discussion. I'm Charlene Del Muro, and I will be acting as the moderator today. I work in the Office of University Events and Protocol, and I'm also a proud SF State alumna. Our first read for the Gator Great Book Club was The Last Watchman of Old Cairo by Michael David Lukas, which won the 2018 National Jewish Book Award in Fiction. Michael has graciously agreed to join us today for our Q&A session. Welcome, Michael, and thank you for your participation. Could you please tell us a little about yourself?
Well, I'm Michael David Lucas. I grew up in the Bay Area, and so San Francisco State has been sort of a part of my life for a long time. But for the past 2 years, I have been a assistant professor here, and so I'm really honored to have been chosen for the inaugural Great Gator Book Club. And yeah.
Thank you. And we do have the common connection of SF State, and we'd love to hear a little bit more about your experience here. What was your first impression of SF State?
Well, I actually taught one semester at State before I was a tenure track faculty member. And my wife was also an adjunct professor at State for a couple of years, actually. And so it's been kind of a part of my life for a while. And I think the biggest thing for me is what an amazing, inquisitive, and engaged student body we have. And I think the other thing that really struck me when I started working here is, I would tell people, oh, I'm starting a job at State, or oh, I teach at State. And not everybody, but maybe every other person who I talk to, whether it be, another parent at my daughter's preschool, or, the events manager at a bookstore, whatever it might, someone who I met at a dinner party, have some connection to State, whether they went there as an undergrad or got their teaching credential there, or, their partner went there. It's just an institution that touches so many people in the Bay Area. And yeah, that's one reason that I'm really proud to work here.
Great, thank you. And here's a little background information on how we selected The Last Watchman of Old Cairo as our first read. I recommended it as both my husband and we read it and we deeply, deeply enjoyed it. We love reading books that transport us around the world and give us insight into other cultures. And in this time of sheltering in place, it's wonderful to read a book that gives us the opportunity to travel through your words. Visiting Egypt is on my travel bucket list, and reading your book really made Old Cairo come alive to us. So thank you for that. And before we delve further into these discussion questions, can you tell us more about your time in Cairo and how your experience living there shaped this story?
Yeah. So I first went to Cairo when I was a junior in college. And I decided to study abroad for one semester in Cairo and one semester in Tel Aviv. And Cairo was first. And it was the first time that I had ever lived in the Arab world. It was the first time I'd ever lived in a really huge city. And it just kind of, I don't know, it hit me really hard. It's such an amazing, beautiful, sublime, decrepit, overwhelming, polluted, welcoming place. And I really just took to it. I was taking a bunch of Arabic classes and some literature classes, but when I wasn't in class, the rest of the time I just kind of wandered around the city. And it's the kind of place where you can, if you were me, a 20-year-old guy who looks like maybe he doesn't belong there, you can just kind of wander throughout the city, and people will just invite you to have tea with them, or share their lunch, or they'll invite you back to their house for dinner. And I can't say that I took everyone up on their invitation, because I'd still be going to people's houses for dinner. It looks like someone's listening to Huey Lewis here, who is also a Bay Area native, so maybe fitting. But in any case, yeah. So I went. I just really took to the city. The one thing though that felt a bit like, I don't know, discordant, I guess is the word, is trying to square my love of the city with my Jewish identity, and to a lesser extent my American identity. It was the beginning of the Second Intifada in Israel and Palestine, and there was a lot of anger against Israel, and for Egyptians, there's not that much distinction between the actions of Israel and Jews in general, in part because the only Jews they ever see are Israeli soldiers on Al Jazeera for the most part. In any case, I had a hard time sort of squaring these two things, and I didn't really tell people. I didn't really come out to people as Jewish when I was there. So I actually don't know how they would have responded, how a lot of people would have responded. But so one day I am wandering around in this neighborhood called Old Cairo, also known as Coptic Cairo, and I came upon a graveyard, and I noticed on some of the gravestones there were Jewish names, and then I noticed some Hebrew letters, and then I kind of wandered further into it and saw that there's a synagogue attached to the graveyard, and I listened into this one tour guide giving a guided tour of the synagogue, and he was talking about 1,000 years of Jewish life in Cairo. And that idea that there had been Jews in the city for 1,000 years just really blew my mind. For some perspective, that's 3 times as long as Jews have been in the United States. So you think the community here is well established, that multiply that by 3, which is not to say that it was a cakewalk the entire time. Also not to say that those 350 years here have been a cakewalk the entire time. But that depth and richness of history really sort of changed my perspective on the city and my relationship to the city. And I became kind of obsessed with the Jewish community of Cairo, and decided when I came back to the United States that I wanted to write a book about it. Now the story of actually writing that book and making it happen is a much longer one, and it wasn't until about 10 years later that I actually started writing this book in earnest, but the kind of seeds of it were planted 20 years ago in the year 2000 when I was living there.
Thank you. And now, why don't we jump into the discussion questions? The Last Watchman of Old Cairo braids together 3 narratives that span several centuries and many generations, taking the reader from 11th century Cairo and Victorian England to the 21st century America. Could you discuss the role that history and the sense of the historical journey play in this novel?
Yeah, I mean, it's really is a book about history. And for a long time, actually, Joseph, the main contemporary character, was a historian finishing his graduate work in history. And not unlike my wife, who is a historian. But, so it was always a book about history, but it's really a book about people think about history often as being about, people are making these big decisions that are changing folks' lives. This is a book about, the stories of sort of everyday people, who are, experiencing the past in a variety of different ways. There's a set of documents that sits at the sort of heart of the book called the Geniza documents. They're also called the Cairo Geniza. And the story behind these documents is that in Jewish law, if you're a very observant Jew, you don't throw away or destroy a piece of paper that might have the name of God written on it. And so a lot of communities will collect all these potential godly documents and bury them in a special part of the graveyard of the cemetery. But this community, for a variety of reasons, because the Jewish cemetery was quite far away, decided to put their documents, their Geniza documents, in the attic of their synagogue, or in a kind of storeroom at the back of their synagogue. And what ended up happening, because the climate is so dry, and because this community who's been around for so long, is that there ended up being 1,000 years worth of documents in the attic of this synagogue, which were basically regarded as a kind of trash. And so to me, that idea serves as sort of like a metaphor behind the book. And so when I think about the type of history that I'm writing about, it's not like your carefully curated documents that like will exist in an archive. It's more this sort of mishmash of daily life that comes together to create, an incredibly rich, social or cultural kind of historical sense. And that's really what I was trying to do with the book, is to sort of explore, history and obsession, and what gets passed down to us through the ages.
Great, thank you. And also in the novel, fictional creations are blended with real characters, such as the Cambridge scholar Rabbi Solomon Schlechter and Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson, the Presbyterian twin sisters from Cambridge, who help protect the Geniza at the Ibn Ezra Synagogue. Can you discuss the research that went in behind creating these characters, and how the relationship between fact and fiction affected the storytelling?
Yeah. So Dr. Solomon Schechter is a pretty well-known rabbi. For whatever reason, there's a lot of Jewish day schools in the United States are named after him. There's a whole sort of like chain of Jewish day schools. They're called Solomon Schechter Day Schools. And he was also the first president of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, which ordains conservative rabbis, if that means anything to anyone. So him and Agnes and Margaret are real people who, all have had biographies written about them. Agnes and Margaret both wrote books themselves. And so there's a good deal of sort of primary and secondary documents that exist about these people. And so when I was approaching them, I knew I wanted to be somewhat careful. With my first book, I had also a couple sort of real historical personages who I was writing about, including the Sultan Abdulhamid II, who was one of the last sultans of the Ottoman Empire. And with that book, with that first book, I kind of played it a little fast and loose. I figured, I'm writing a novel, it's fiction, it's on the reader to kind of decide or figure out what's real and what's not real. And two things made me kind of change my perspective. The first was going to book clubs around the Bay Area and around the country, and talking to people about my first book, and hearing the way they talk about it, that they took my book as historical fact without ever questioning it. And so engaging with people and seeing how they sort of read the book really made me think about my responsibilities as someone writing historical fiction. The other thing is I sent the book to one of my professors from undergrad who uh, was an expert in the end of the Ottoman Empire. And he read the book and he said, I loved it. It's a great novel. But I wonder why you felt like you could, you know, deviate from the established historical fact. And he was a very gentle man and he phrased it very gently like that. But he was clearly sort of disappointed and felt like I hadn't learned um, the lessons that he wanted to teach in his class. And that really made me reflect on, you know, okay, what are my responsibilities to my readers and what are my responsibilities to history in general? Um, and so, long story short, when I started writing this book, I really tried to be much more careful um, when I was writing about people who actually existed. Now, there's certainly characters who I made up. You know, the main contemporary character, Joseph or Yusef, totally made him up. And even his whole family, the El Raqab family, this Muslim family who for generations serves as watchmen of the synagogue in Cairo, I made them up, and they're not without, you know, some sort of historical precedent. There are definitely Muslim families that have watched over synagogues and other Jewish holy spaces, but this particular family, you know, is fictional. Um, but I tried to, you know, keep to that established historical fact, as my professor said, a bit more with this book, while also sort of recognizing that at the end of the day, it is fiction, and it's not a book of history.
Okay, great, thank you.
Hmm.
And then, what does this novel tell us about the relationships between people of different faiths and how they intersect, both historically and in the contemporary moment?
Yeah, I mean, that's really a big part of sort of what drove me to write the book. As I was researching the Jewish community in Cairo, I realized that their story is, you know, obviously about themselves and, you know, what it was like to be, you know, a Jew at this time in this city, but it was also about a relationship between peoples of different faiths. Cairo was and continues to be, in a certain extent, a very multi-ethnic, multi-religious city, and so any story that you tell about, you know, one community in the city has to necessarily be about other communities. And so while it may seem like a kind of story about a long time ago in a place far, far away, I think that the lessons that you can take from that history and that community and that 1,000 years definitely resonates with today, because, you know, so many of the questions that we're dealing with today have to do with what it means to live in a multi-ethnic society, what it means to encounter people who are different than you in all sorts of ways, and have different accesses to power and different privileges. And that's something that sort of comes up again and again for these characters, is many of them are kind of insiders and outsiders. They, you know, have access to power and privilege in some ways, but are excluded from it in other ways.
Okay, thank you. And a favorite moment of ours is when Joseph is recalling his visit to Cairo and the boat trip where his father tells him the story behind the meaning and significance of their last name. Can you discuss the theme of fathers and sons in this novel?
Yeah, I mean, that's another big piece of it. This El Raqab family passes the watch of the synagogue down from fathers to sons, from father to son, father to son. And so it's sort of necessarily a big part of it. But it's something I'm definitely interested in, although I don't have any sons myself. I just have two daughters, which is wonderful. I do have a father and a stepfather too. And so I was interested in kind of what gets passed down, both, kind of genetically, biologically, but also culturally between, members of a family, and particularly male members of a family. That's something that has resonance for me. And although I have a close relationship with my father, I was interested in how that would change and how that would be affected for someone who didn't have a close relationship with their father, someone who felt sort of like distant from their father, as I have at points of my life. And yeah, no, so that was a sort of core theme for me of the book, and something I really wanted to investigate.
Okay, great. Thank you. And how important are the names in this novel? In what way is Joseph's mission to uncover the story behind the ancient Ben Ezra synagogue in keeping with his heritage?
Very much so. I mean, the whole, even just Joseph's name in itself, some people call him Joseph, some people call him Yusuf. Um, and it's never really established, what his preferred name is. And, or the synagogue, it's often referred to as the Ben Ezra synagogue. I call it the Ibn Ezra synagogue, for sort of similar reasons as the Joseph Yusuf distinction. So, what we're called in various circumstances has a really profound effect on, how we see ourselves, and how other people see us. And so I wanted to kind of dig into that, with the names. And there's certainly some resonance between, the Ben Ezra synagogue, or the Ibn Ezra synagogue, whatever you want to call it, the Ezra Scroll, and then the prophet Ezra, who was said to have written this sort of mythical Ezra Scroll. And yeah, so it sort of works on a number of levels, I could say, I guess.
Okay, great, great. And then let's talk about the Ezra Scroll. What role does mystery and adventure play in Joseph's search for the Ezra Scroll?
Well, I should say that the Ezra Scroll is this kind of magical Torah scroll that's rumored to be in the book. It's rumored to be in the Ibn Ezra synagogue, and kind of serves as a focal point for a number of the different characters. And I first saw reference to this scroll in a footnote of a book about Jewish mysticism, by a guy named Gershom Shalom. And when I saw that footnote, I realized, like, oh gosh, this is the kind of magic that I want in the book. It's it's a scroll that is rumored to be, the perfect Torah scroll. The prophet Ezra, one of the things he's known for is he took all the kind of like imperfect versions of the Torah, and he quote unquote cleansed them, to turn them into a kind of unimpeachable document that's said to be, the word of God. And so I was really interested in, this idea of, someone who's constantly striving to write a book that's very good, or striving towards perfection in literature, what it means to have a book that is actually, quote unquote perfect, and what that would mean for people who see this as the word of God, and how it would sort of inspire people to do things they might not otherwise do, or to push them towards places they might not otherwise go. And in the end, I won't spoil anything, but let's just say in the end, it doesn't necessarily get resolved. And it's definitely a question I get a lot. But I have to break it to people often that I just made it up. And so there isn't really an actual answer.
Okay, okay, great. And can you talk a little bit about what role does cultural identity and heritage play in this novel? I had read an article where you said that of all the characters you've created, that Joseph is the one who you relate to the most.
Yeah, he's everyone else is either hundreds or almost 1,000 years removed from my experience, and so there's that. Joseph is about my same age. He is living in Cairo at the same time that I am. He's got some kind of similarities to me. There's some big differences. He's half Muslim, and I'm not. He's gay, and I'm not. He doesn't have a very good relationship with his father, and I do. And yet, when I was trying to write the book, I always kind of thought of myself in Joseph's position. And I was often trying to kind of shoehorn my experiences into his narrative. It actually gave me a lot of trouble, sort of the identification that I had with him, because I didn't really want to deviate too much from my experience when I was writing his plot line. And it ended up being a process of really having to separate myself from him, in order to kind of write his section. It's kind of like, I guess, the relationship that you have with a kid as they get older and older. You have to kind of recognize that they're, a part of you, but their own person, and you want them to sort of live their own life, and be happy. But with a kid, they actually are their own person, and with a fictional character, you still just made them up.
Great, great. Well, thank you so much. And it looks like our time here is drawing to a close. Thank you so much again for this fascinating behind the scenes look at the last Watchman of Old Cairo. And we really appreciate you taking the time to answer these questions. And we'd also like to hear, are you working on any current projects that you'd like to talk about?
Sure. I'm working on a new novel, that's a retelling of the biblical book of Esther. It's an interesting book to me, and set in the future. So I was interested in this book because it's a book about evil, and it's also a book about revenge and beauty and these kind of big topics. But it's also the only biblical book that's set in the diaspora. And so, being someone who as a diasporic person and being interested in what it means to live in the diaspora, I was really drawn to this story. It's also a really weird story. When Jews celebrate Purim, people often say it's like the Jewish Halloween. You dress up and you sort of retell the story, and you're supposed to get so drunk that you can't tell the difference between the hero and the villain. And so it's really a story about boundaries and what good and evil means, and so I was just really intrigued by this story, and wanting to sort of investigate these themes. And so wouldn't it be cool to sort of like rewrite this but set in the future? So that's what I'm doing.
Great, great. Well, that sounds amazing, and I can't wait to read it when it comes out. So I will look out for it for sure.
Great.
Great. Well, thank you again for your participation, and we wish you the best with this upcoming project. And I just wanted to thank all of the Gators for being part of the Gator Great Book Club. And we will be announcing our second read shortly, so please stay tuned. And this concludes our interview session. So thanks again to everyone, and go Gators.
Thanks so much. It was really a pleasure.